Thanks, Alicia. Good morning, everyone. It's Friday. I hope that means something awesome for everybody and that you are blessed with phenomenal weather, whatever that is for you for the weekend. Thanks for giving us another day of your time. We greatly appreciate it. I feel like one of the things that's missing in this kind of Zoom platform is a lot of opportunity for us to actually discuss things. I love that you're putting things in chat because we can collect those and historically keep them aside and share them. And we'll also put those in our CE moderator, uh, mo- CE adopters group, excuse me, so that people can have access to those along with all the templates and just a good place for us to share with our colleagues across the country about the studio model. But this morning, what we normally get the best feedback on when we do these across the country in person is that individuals really love the opportunity to talk with each other, to share experiences, to ask questions, to debate what was the right thing or wrong thing or better thing to do in studios. So we built in some significant time this morning just to have those chats. There were a lot of great questions and comments that came up in our chat box yesterday. And we certainly did not get to all of them related to the studio because we knew we had some time built in this morning. So with that, I'd like to do two things. One, we're going to open up with a poll just because they're fun and I like it and it breaks things up a little bit. And let's see how we're doing this morning. So what in the world for $500? Which CES community expert behavior caught us by surprise? All right, we're up to almost 30. I'm hoping you all can't hear the really loud baby birds that have built a nest right beside where I am. All right, 34. Give you 5 more seconds. All right, let's close it up. Okay, so 25%, a community expert who was using Zoom on her phone, got in her car, drove to Walmart and began shopping. A community expert who brought his dog to the CES. An expert that showed up with their mom who insisted on sitting in on the CES. An expert who took a phone call and began loudly speaking. An expert that excused herself to go to the restroom and appeared to be impaired when they returned, or all of the above. Y'all, it is all of the above. We have had all of these things happen in a community engagement studio, and I guess it's just because we've been doing it for so long, but that is why nothing ever shocks me anymore. So all of the above, just prepare yourself for any of these things and more adventures to happen if you decide to start doing community engagement studios at your institution. So with that, I just want to open us up for some questions and for some dialogue. I'd love to hear your feedback about the community engagement studio. And I don't want to like call on people, but I've been known to do that. I feel like you all have great energy. So you can ask any questions you'd like. And we've got all of our colleagues from Utah, Michigan, and Vandy. So Devan and Leah are here as well. So we're happy to answer any questions you had. We'd also just love to hear your feedback about just watching the studio and the interaction.
This is Carmen from Puerto Rico.
Good morning, Carmen.
Good morning. I had a great time yesterday, I have to say, and it was such a privilege to be able to look into this experience and be a part, at least listen to and see everything that was going on. I thought that I learned so much as a facilitator. I've done focus groups for a long time, but I think you managed this one with such mastery. I think it was really bringing them back to the topic, helping them open up. I thought that was really important. And I thought the participants were just fabulous. I mean, they had different points of view. They were in different places, and they all had the spirit of communicating what they thought would be helpful for others. gave me a lot of enthusiasm to participate. I think you did a really good selection in terms of the people that were there at different moments in the disease, different demographics. So I just want to thank you very much for this experience. And our team while we're watching this and participating in this, we're planning on when we're going to start this. So thank you.
That's wonderful to hear. For everybody else in the training, 2 different times our team had planned a trip to Puerto Rico, and both times some crazy natural disaster occurred. And so we just felt like that was the, higher powers saying, don't go to Puerto Rico. I didn't want to plan anything else, Carmen, because I didn't want anything else bad to happen to Puerto Rico.
Yeah, but don't worry. This will pass, and we would really love to have you here. This is something that makes a lot of sense here, especially for our researchers that have a lot of interest in having community engagement, but don't have the tools. So I think this is just really going to be very important. So thank you.
Wonderful. We welcome all invites to come see our colleagues across the country and world, I should say, because I know we have our colleagues from the UK joining us. It's interesting. Sometimes we just really luck out and have a really great group of folks that have these diverse experiences and perspectives. I thought it was really interesting. I know I commented on this yesterday when I did Richard's Zoom orientation. He was very quiet. And I said, so Richard, when we have our meeting next week, you have to promise me you'll help you open up and feel comfortable, like sharing and giving feedback and advice. He said, I'm not really a talker, Tiffany. I don't really feel comfortable like sharing in those settings, but I'll try. And I was like, okay, that's not a problem. Let me give you some primers you can be thinking about so you'll feel more comfortable sharing. But one of the things that I thought was most interesting is that he did talk a lot, and he mentioned the homeopathy, and that was obviously a really important thing to him. And so someone on the outside listening in may think, oh, that's just one random person who that's really important. But I don't know if you all noticed that towards the end, Marcus mentioned, oh yeah, I take milk thistle and I drink dandelion tea. And so I thought it was really important for our nephrologists to hear that, because they may have thought Richard was just kind of a one-off, but we hear stuff about homeopathy in studios about all the chronic conditions, whether we're looking at lupus or HIV or liver disease. There's always some folks who are seeking alternatives to the heavy bouts of medication that they're taking. So I thought that was really interesting. We have a couple of stuff in our chat box. To establish a CES in our institution, where is a good place to start? Minimum level of staff and resources, and what about institutional support? Elizabeth, that's a great question. I'm going to let our colleagues from the other institutions chat about that too, because we have some folks in here. Heidi is here with us from Heidi, New Mexico. Heidi is here with us. So everybody's in a different phase of kind of kicking off the studio program. So we've been doing it for 11 years, but then Heidi is at the beginning in her institution, as is Dartmouth. I think they've done maybe 1 or 2 of kind of kicking theirs off. So it looks really different for all the institutions. Our institution started the studio program through an NIH supplement that was affiliated with our CTSA award, so the Clinical Translational Science Award. We received an NIH supplement in collaboration with UNC and our partners there to test out community patient engagement models to enhance research. UNC took an entirely different route, a much more intensive kind of long-term collaborative relationship building between a researcher and a community. We took this other route because we didn't have researchers who would be prepared or willing to do that at Vanderbilt. So that's how we initially developed the community engagement studio model. Leah mentioned yesterday that we actually piloted it based on an existing model at Vanderbilt that used researchers as the experts to give feedback on pre-submission publications or the design elements, et cetera, all the same elements, but from a researcher perspective. So we based our model on that using community experts. When our supplement ran out, our CTSA saw the value and appreciated the feedback they were getting from their own internal leadership. And so they built it into our CTSA award. So our institution provides vouchers, which cover the cost of their community engagement studios. And we have historically provided those for Vanderbilt and Meharry, but now Jillian at Meharry is kicking off Meharry's own internal program. So they're also kind of at the beginning. So I'll be quiet, and Heidi, Jillian, some folks from Dartmouth at the beginning of this. I know Joellen's on here. If you all want to speak to maybe how your able to start funding your program and what kind of resources you feel like should be in place?
Sure, I'll jump in. We haven't done our first studios yet. They're actually scheduled. We have two scheduled at the end of May, but we are also part of the Clinical and Translational Science Awards and in New Mexico in Albuquerque. And we already have a team of 4 people that just do community engagement research in various capacities. And we already have a lot of experience with recruitment and focus groups, like all these various skills that relate directly with studios. So we all are just chipping in. We didn't hire anyone new. And we all just plan to continue with our current team with the studios. But the CTSA award, our most recent grant, is funding us to pilot the studio program so we can do it for free and have some guinea pig studies, so they don't have to pay for us to do it as we're figuring it out, but then we plan to charge after that. And I really appreciate the breakdown yesterday that Bree gave with the hours and how much they charge at Utah. That'll come in really handy as we're figuring out what to charge.
Joellen, could you share what Dartmouth is doing to kick off your program? Because you guys are even a little earlier in the process, I think.
We've hosted a few studios now, which is exciting. We just had one last week. Funding is something that I think we're still very much figuring out. We have one person at Dartmouth that really kind of pushes this through as a side job almost, as part of her job. And we actually rely really heavily on our Masters of Public Health students, which I am one. And so we have, I think, 3 MPH students right now that are working on going through and doing the vast majority of the work for most of our studios. One thing that we did that I think has been really great to get kind of our team up and running and to start spreading the word at Dartmouth is we've partnered with the Norris Cotton Cancer Center at Dartmouth. And so through some funding from the Cancer Center, we actually were able to recruit for 5 studios. So we kind of put out a call to all of the cancer researchers at Dartmouth, and they were able to kind of submit if they were interested. And we got a pretty good response rate there. And we have 5 researchers that are really excited. And so we just did the first of those cancer studios last week, 2 weeks ago, and we have another one coming up on Tuesday. So that's been a really nice opportunity to kind of kick off our program.
Yeah, I will say to both you and Heidi, and I know Utah has even done some studios for some for-profit entities who've paid them for those services. But it seems like if you join the CES adopters group, you'll see that it's this huge continuum. There's no like right or wrong. So if you have a CTSA or CTSI, you might be able to build it into that because they are supposed to have community engagement across the continuum of their CTSA. And this is a piece of or an element that they could include in that. If you have qualitative cores, this could be tucked under a qualitative core possibly as a piece of a service. Or if you have a community engagement research core, it could fall under that. We do have researchers, even though you can receive vouchers at Vanderbilt, that will write the cost of the studio into their proposals, because we always tell folks there is no guarantee on vouchers. We've never received from our leadership, you can only do X number of studios a year. But because of that, we also know there's no guarantee. So we let researchers know, apply for your voucher. Once you have your voucher, we can do it for you. But if you wait and then you get funding a year from now, then we can't make you any guarantees. So they'll just write it into their grant proposals at this point, which I really like to see. That's nice. George asked a question about what methods work best to enable participants to share as much as they can, but also recognize that there are some time limitations. That's a good question. I will say I'll go first and then let my other colleagues jump in. For me, it's just a delicate balance, and every studio is so incredibly different. I try to let people tell enough of the story to give context for the researchers. But as soon as I sense that it's starting to veer off into an area that I don't feel like the researchers will understand how to incorporate into their study. So if they start talking about other family members who have different health conditions that aren't necessarily related, and I can't figure out a way in my head really quickly to tie it to the project. Or if we have this happen a lot, if we start going down a path where the patient experts, they're, you know, our community experts are patients in this forum, they start asking a lot of health questions, then I usually will like kind of jump in and say, I know that it's so tempting because we have two phenomenal physicians today in front of us to ask a lot of health questions, but I want to caution us because they're not your provider. And it's really important that you talk to your provider about these things. But also I want to keep us on track today. We only have 2 hours. And as you guys can see, it is flying by. And usually people are like, oh yeah, okay. They don't get upset or frustrated. I'm usually pretty lucky with that. So I would love to hear from, you know, Meghan or Bree or anyone that's on that has some other ideas. For me, it's just every studio is really, really differently. And I just keep trying to pull us back to the question that we're asking.
Yeah, I can share just a little bit. So one thing I think that's just really helpful is setting that expectation at the very beginning. Like just coming out and being straightforward and saying, look, we have so much to cover. I'm sure you guys have so much experience and expertise to share, but we only have a limited amount of time. So let's be mindful of, you know, focusing on the topic at hand, sharing the space, making sure that everyone has the opportunity to participate. So I think that's an important part. And I also think it's asking the right questions so that we get to the meat of the conversation.
Yeah, Megan?
Yeah, I was gonna chime in that I received a great tip for facilitation when you have a over talker, especially, is kind of summarizing the last 3 words that they said. So saying, or the last kind of sentence, yeah, I hear you that you're saying about that you think the vaccine was rushed. What do you think, Tiffany? So you're hearing them and then moving on. That's been a great tip. I actually find sometimes my difficulty is the faculty want to talk a lot. So trying to steer them to say, well, let's make sure we get through all of your questions. You know, we're tight on time, the same things. And also trying to still remain neutral of summing up to, okay, what I heard from everyone was that we think this high blood pressure study is really important, but we're worried about extra testing that has to be involved. So that's something that's helpful too. I sat in on a studio that Tiffany did, so I got to watch the best. So trying to listen in on others that I think do it really well. We have one of our staff people is a trained facilitator through a training she did with Michigan State University. And reading different facilitator guides and things like that. But it's definitely a skill. Sometimes our scribe too, she'll jump in if somebody's really oversharing at some point, and she'll be like, oh, hey, really quick, what was that point? Just so I make sure I have it right on the note. So I guess it's sort of a team effort for sure.
I was going to say there's nothing more awkward than after you've had like a moment with a faculty PI where you've had to like really like be firm with them in a studio space to get them to be quiet. There's nothing more awkward than when you get on the elevator with them and you're like, good morning. Like, how are you today? Because it isn't awkward. They're not used to not being in charge of a room a lot of times. And so it can be awkward depending on their level of forgiveness and grace, to be quite frank. I've had PIs when I've said in a room, you know, so and so, I'm so sorry, but I'm really mindful of time. And they've been like, oh, I'm sorry, I'm doing it again, I'm talking too much. And they really own it. And they're really graceful and give a lot, they're very humble about it. But others, I can tell just by their body language, they kind of stiffen up and they get really like quiet. And I try to keep warming them up throughout the studio, but that's really awkward sometimes. Leah and Devan, you guys do some facilitating too. Did you want to jump in here with any thoughts about that?
Devan, anything?
I don't know that I have too much to add.
I think Brieanne's or Bree's point too about sort of setting expectations in our faculty meeting too. We'll say, we just want you to sit back and listen and relax. And then the same thing when we're doing the orientation with the experts. If you're the more quiet person, we want you, like Tiffany said yesterday, we definitely want you to step up more. I think the Zoom features have helped a little bit too. Raise your hand, reactions. I have one expert that only participates solely through the chat. So, you know, we're just sort of take it and also have to say, oh, I saw Jane made her point about this.
That's
kind of
really
going
interesting.
with the flow, right?
I will say one, oh, go ahead, Tiffany.
No, you go, Leah. I was going to jump to the next question, so go, please.
I was just going to mention something that I think we thought would be more helpful initially, was using the chat feature with our investigators. So we initially thought that maybe having investigators sort of message the facilitator or message the member of staff to, ask additional questions would be great. Like, oh, what a great way to use the chat feature. But we've actually found it to be incredibly distracting. So we, in a lot of cases, sort of discourage our investigators from using the chat feature to communicate with the facilitator, since they're sort of already having to watch the chat for expert comments or to communicate with their scribe or another member of staff. So that was something just initially that we thought was going to be great, but then we found that investigators were sort of overusing it to try to control, again, the direction of the conversation. So just something to be mindful of. Obviously, I think it depends on the investigator, but I think it's been more distracting than helpful.
Yeah, I will say to Leah's point really quickly, we even have, so because Zoom allows multiple folks from research teams to be in listen only mode. So we only have 2 research team members who have their camera on. Everyone else can call in and listen. So that means we had a multi-site clinical trial. I think this was the COVID one, Leah and Devan, correct me if I'm wrong, where we had probably almost a dozen research team members in listen only mode. And one of the co-PIs from another site, who we really had not had a lot of interaction with, was rapid fire sending me chats to, like, you need to call on this person, you need to ask this person these questions, you need to. And I messaged Leah and said, please make so-and-so stop chatting me. And she's my buffer because it was just rapid fire. And then the co-PI actually sent us an apology later and was like, I'm so sorry. I see how that could have been really distracting. And I wished I jumped in. I just got excited. So yeah, that happens sometimes as well. I think I cannot see everyone's windows, but I got a chat. I think, Kyra, did you have your hand up?
I did.
Jump in, please.
Yeah, and I usually just raise my hand because I'm, the whole Zoom environment, jumping in, interrupting. I'm just, so I usually just raise my hand. But yeah, I think to the point of, I guess, this conversation, one of the things I appreciated most was that it wasn't the PI that was doing the facilitating, and that, you're kind of keeping that neutral zone so it doesn't feel like this kind of rapid fire, or that it doesn't feel like, or at least from the participants or the community expert standpoint, that dynamic. I did want to ask, though, just I guess in the spirit of, so at the end of the studio, like, I think you had kind of winded down the community experts, and then I noticed that the PI started asking questions. From an observer standpoint, that felt a little disorienting, and I was wondering if that was actually part of the script or if that was spontaneous, because I noticed it, and a part of me feels like that was probably spontaneous.
Yeah, it was all spontaneous. I mean, the whole studio was I mean, in a way spontaneous, right? That was definitely a live studio with, anything could have happened. We had no idea. So I'm glad that it's over. but yeah, that was completely spontaneous. And one of the challenges yesterday is that we normally have a full 2 hours.
Mm-hmm.
So I would have made some more breaks in there for the research team to ask questions than I did yesterday. But because we were on such a tight schedule, and it wasn't even, I have to finish in an hour and a half, I need to finish an hour and a half and jump back into the Zoom with you guys. So I was really mindful of time.
Mm-hmm.
Normally in that scenario, I would say, even if we were doing the 2 hour studio, I would say, oh, these are great questions. Well, before I take anyone else's time, community experts, do you all have about 5 minutes to cover this, or would you prefer me email you to follow up and you guys could answer via email? I would have done something like that. And if experts needed to leave, they could have, and the ones who stayed would have answered the question. I really quickly was trying to think what's the fastest way I can get concise feedback for her on this topic so that we can wrap up, because we were already 3 or 4 minutes over. And so I felt like that was probably show of hands, head nods. That was like the fastest way I could get that.
Which was good. And I think from the observer standpoint, I feel like that was a good learning experience being on the outside of that, because I think it drove home like when we talk about the components that you need for a studio, one of the things, that was mentioned was a facilitation guide. Because I know, even with doing sessions of different types, sometimes when you are in the chair doing the facilitating or a part of the group, you don't realize the impact of maybe steering away from certain things and how that might feel on, those who are participating. And so that's what that made me kind of realize when I noticed kind of, just that shift between, okay, we're winding down, and then it was like, oh, well, what do you think about this? What do you think? And it was like, noted. Let me make sure that, just keeping those things in mind. Like that was kind of the learning part for me.
Yeah, I tell you, I learned something in every single studio I do. I walk away from every single one and I'll sit with it for like a day or two and kind of reflect on, could I have done that differently, better? How could I have handled that? I'll tell you, one of the most intense Zoom studios we've done, and it was right at the beginning of our Zooms, is we did a series of studios to inform a COVID social media campaign related to enrolling into research. And we recruited nationally. We did 3 studios. They were all recruiting folks in hotspot cities. So we had one for African-American, Black Americans. We had one for Spanish speaking bilingual bicultural Americans. And then we had one for 65 and older. I think I mentioned that yesterday. And everyone had some form of chronic health condition, which would make them more susceptible to catching COVID. And one of the first studios that we did was with African-American, Black Americans. And I knew a handful of folks in there who had participated before, who had organizing backgrounds, but had since moved from Nashville. And we kicked off, with a little presentation about the purpose of the project. And then, so my first question was, I would really love to get your all's feedback around the messaging that this study has kind of crafted. How did it hit you? What were your first impressions, et cetera? And one of the men in that studio said, he just kind of leaned back in his chair and he said, I gotta be honest with you, Tiffany, I don't think any of us give a shit about this study right now. We got too much going on in the world. And I was like, I hear you. Let's sit with that for a minute. Let's talk about the things that are important right now. Let's talk about the things that are hitting your community. What do you want to talk about today? Let's talk about it. And I messaged the research team member and said, I'm just letting you know, I don't know where this is going to go, but we're going to unpack this because it's obviously, this is important and it's a priority. And they were like, no, absolutely. We spent the first 30 minutes of that studio having dialogue just about where our country was and what the priorities were for their communities where they lived. And we just talked about it and asked strategic questions. Well, so knowing that that's occurring in your community, how are people going to react when someone approaches them to be involved in a research study? So I tried to continue to bring it back to research in a way, but still let us focus on unpacking what was happening. And by the end of the first 30 minutes, everybody seemed a little less like, okay, got it out there. We needed to say it. And one of the members of the community experts said, but listen, let's get back to your study for a second, because I've been thinking about this. This vaccine is important to the community, and so they brought us back to the project. I didn't have to. They brought us back to the project when they were ready and when the time was right for them. And it ended up being a phenomenal studio. And the 2 research team members later, we had a little debrief and they were like, that was exhausting for me emotionally, like spiritually. I'm so glad you were facilitating that and your team was there. I don't think I could have handled that kind of conversation. But these were like 2 very middle-class white women who have no work in this space whatsoever. And so it was good that they just sat back and listened and got to hear from folks in our community across the country. That was one of the most intense studios I think we've done via Zoom, but that was, sometimes you just need to sit back and be quiet. Other colleagues from across the country doing studios, if you've had some other facilitation challenges that have pushed you as just like a human?
Yeah, I think I believe Felicia and Marquetta are on this call who were in this studio where we had someone, it was around COVID. I think it's just been so difficult for this particular person was very isolated, was only doing curbside pickups and things like that, and was getting really emotional because she felt like the others in her circle were saying she was being too cautious and things like that. And we actually stopped and just, let her take a pause. And Felicia actually gave her this really beautiful sentiment and inspirational statement about her efforts. And it was really nice. And I felt like that studio actually just sort of became a group therapy. It was just very cathartic for the entire group, that they didn't feel so alone with the choices that they were making around COVID.
Yeah, I wonder, did you all notice yesterday, like Dennis and a couple of other folks were like, it was just really great connecting with people. It was great hearing their stories. It was nice to see where different people were. We hear that in studios constantly. Hey, Megan, I see you have your hand up, and I think I'm lucking out just because you're on my screen.
Yeah, so I have to admit that this studio happened when I was on maternity leave this fall, but it's something that my group and I have discussed, and I'm curious as to if anyone else has sort of come across this and how you addressed it. So we've done 3 virtual studios now since the start of the pandemic. And with the one studio we had in the fall, we have had a community facilitator for every single studio we've done. We haven't done any of the facilitating ourselves. So we ran into this issue where it was almost like the community facilitator, throughout the process of like working with the facilitator to put together the guide and everything, she was very pushy with her own beliefs. And it almost got to the point where like it was very hard for my teammates to like sort of work through that. It was almost like she should have just been a community expert rather than a facilitator. And like that was really hard to navigate, because it was like 2 days before we're supposed to have the studio, and we're like, how do we find another facilitator, or how do we work with the one that we currently have to make sure that she's not like, we loved her passion, but I think that we're afraid it was going to honestly steer the studio in a way that that she would have taken over it. So I'm just curious if you've come across that, or if anyone else has, and how it's been addressed.
It's actually why we transitioned for a little while to not using community facilitators, to be honest, as we had a few different incidents. I had one where a facilitator stated, oh, I would never join this study in the studio, or just oversharing of their own personal relations to that. And not all of our facilitators did it, but we had it happen so many times that we sat back and said, we really need a strong facilitators training. Because some of these, and we needed to choose our facilitators more carefully. So someone might think, oh, if you would fit into this demographic because you have this health condition, or you've been a caregiver, et cetera. And I'll give you an example. I was passing off all of our studios with caregivers of children who have autism to my old boss, because I have a child who is autistic. And I was like, don't want to be in that space in that way, trying to facilitate a dialogue when I have really strong opinions and values around that. So I was passing them off to her. But if we do a studio with individuals who are autistic, I'm happy to facilitate that. But that caregiver perspective, I just know it's one of those things really sensitive to me. So, and as social workers, we all have this thing, like you have to kind of know your limitations, what demographics you can work with effectively, populations based on your own kinds of stuff. So yeah, that's an example of where I was like, oh, I can't do that. But we have chatted with Utah, and we've chatted with others about, we have a draft facilitation training. But I would love for colleagues across the country to come together to create a facilitation training. I know that Dartmouth, I think, applied for a grant to put together some training as well. And so I just feel like all of us across the country coming together, because we've learned so much from others who are adapting this model and utilizing it. So we are not the end all to be all at Vanderbilt just because we created it. We love seeing people's adaptations and infrastructure. I tell Bree all the time, I love Utah really rocks at creating like infrastructure, like forums, and that I just love their stuff. That's not my jam at all. So we always learn a lot from everybody. We need a good, strong, I think, facilitators training.
I agree. And I think like I'd be happy to be involved in however that may look, because I think, especially like I said, we've had so we've done 3 virtual and we've done 3 in person, and we've been fortunate enough to use a community member every time. Did I think it was appropriate every time to use a community member? Not really. I think, though, I'm trying to teach my boss a little bit about like the flexibility of the model. Like I think she takes a lot of it as is, like it's Bible. So just trying to, it's a learning process. So I think I would definitely be interested in being able to have a facilitator's training because I think it's not just facilitation in traditional sense, it's definitely in niche. So yeah, that would be great.
And like you said, like knowing your limitations. I've worked with so many demographics of folks across the country in my career, but there are always like new little pockets of folks that I'm like, oh, I've spent the entire first half of my career working with youth. I'd never worked with transgender youth. So when we did that studio, I pulled in a colleague of mine who his whole career had been doing youth organizing, and his organization actually had a really vibrant LGBTQ program for youth. And I knew he was going to be way better at it than me. And my opportunity to watch him facilitate that was going to be a really cool opportunity. So I attended the studio. I actually utilized a Vanderbilt studio or a Vanderbilt student who is transgender to take notes. And I just sat back and listened and took notes myself and kind of learned and watched how skilled he was. And so that was a great learning opportunity for me. So I think that's important too, is kind of acknowledging when there's someone more appropriate maybe to facilitate a studio for whatever reason it might be. If it's okay, I'm going to jump over to some questions and we can all answer them. So can you talk a little bit about conducting a studio with seniors when hearing can be an issue, as well as confusion with technology? So I will say that we have not had a studio that I'm aware of. Leah and Devan, jump in if I'm saying this wrong, with seniors who have had trouble hearing. We have not had that yet. I have done those in person before, and it wasn't the entire room as much as it were one or two. And I sat them where I could stand to facilitate, and I would not ad nauseum, but try to repeat and capture what others in the room were saying, because one member had already told me he had a little trouble hearing. So I just stood in kind of their space while I was facilitating to make it easier for them to hear. But also remember, in person, we're writing in real time. So I'd also direct folks to the feedback. And so we would try to write it large enough and clear enough that folks could also see that. So there were a couple of ways we could manage that in an in-person setting. We have not had that issue with Zoom yet. So I don't feel like I could personally answer that one. In terms of confusion with technology, it's those Zoom orientations where we really try to walk folks through. When I did a Zoom orientation with one of the members from yesterday's studio, they were using their phone, and it took them probably about 6 minutes to figure out how to get their screen on and unmuted. And then once we figured it out, I was like, great, let's turn it off and try it again so that we can make sure that it'll work for you tomorrow. We've had one studio member who, I know Devan and Leah know who I'm talking about. They warn me if I'm not the person doing the Zoom orientations for some reason, they'll say, hey, there's this really great community expert, but they're going to have a lot of trouble with technology, or they're going to have a lot of trouble. And sure enough, during that studio, it kept dropping. They kept trying to help him get back in, and we just kind of went with it. And as soon, I would tell folks in the meeting, if so-and-so is able to log back in, just know I'm going to pause us for a second because I want to capture their feedback just in case we lose them again. And they were like, oh yeah, okay, absolutely. So that prepped everybody. Bree said set expectations, or Meghan said set expectations. So that's what we tried to do. Is there anyone else on our Zoom today who has done Zoom meetings with folks who hearing or technology was a challenge, and you have some thoughts to share on that?
Tiffany, I just wanted to add, because we spoke about this yesterday, one of the things we really love about having a third member who's in charge of tech. So when we do have participants who are struggling with technology, that person can step off the call and work with them one-on-one to make sure that they're comfortable even during the studio.
So has anybody, this is Robin at UC Irvine. Has anybody successfully used the translation thing at the bottom of the Zoom calls? I know that we've used that for some focus groups, and they use that for a start on the transcription. And I think that was really interesting. It's not a great, it's not complete. It doesn't have, so they get a lot of words wrong. And of course the punctuation is never in the right spot if it exists at all. But I think that might be helpful. I think it was actually created for students who have hearing issues. We haven't used it for a studio for ourselves, but we have it in different webinars and that kind of thing. So I thought I'd throw that out there.
Yeah, I'll say we at Vanderbilt have not used it, but has anyone else on the Zoom today used that feature?
We've We've downloaded it just to kind of compare and see if we've missed anything. It doesn't do a great job of saying who's saying what, and there are some errors, as Robin mentioned, but it is an additional resource. And we're also looking into, there's a translation or interpretation feature too, where we're looking into using that for an upcoming session studio.
I would say at Vanderbilt, we have done a couple of different studios where we've used interpreters, which have been interesting. So we've had a facilitator who was English speaking and an interpreter who spoke Arabic, and he was translating during the studio for us. That was the only way we were going to get the information, is to have that translator, which is interesting. It adds this layer, right? So there's like kind of two facilitators in a way, because you know how things are being translated. You can't even pick up on the nuances of language in that scenario. But the researcher gave us good feedback. I think the community experts' feedback was good. Devan's nodding yes, so that's good. I know that Bree answered in the chat a couple of questions about how they give their report back, and also that they do offer a formal training for scribes. I should mention too that we'll have breakout rooms this afternoon. So if there's a particular topic you really want to learn more about, if you want to learn more about Bree's scribe training, if you want to talk about facilitation, we've got multiple areas. You can just choose to hop into a breakout room this afternoon, have smaller discussions, ask your questions, dig in deep. And then if you're like, okay, I had my questions answered about scribing, I want to jump into this other one, this data collection one, you'll come back into the main room and they'll just slide you into a different breakout room. So hopefully that's going to be an opportunity for you to dig even deeper into some of those other topics that you're interested in. I'm wondering about who comes up with questions. In the breakout sessions, it seemed like facilitators were, but I thought previously researchers would come up with the questions. So I can tell you the way it works for Vanderbilt, and then other colleagues can jump in. During our planning meeting, we essentially ask the research team, what kind of information are you hoping to get out of this studio? So when you walk away at the end of the 2 hours, what would be a success for you? And then we kind of have to like walk them through what that might look like. So it might be identifying strategies for recruitment or retention, or what the barriers might be, and then wrapping around to the strategies. They might say that they are wanting to get feedback on the feasibility of the implementation, and is that the right way to go about implementing the project. We get a lot around messaging now. Messaging and materials is one of those things that we get a lot of questions about, and those are always really straightforward studios that usually have some other kind of little nuances to it. If we're talking about, issues around dissemination or analysis, then we try to tap into the perspective of the person who's the focus of the research study, because they may come up with a different lens to view the information through. They're going to have a lot of other community-based outlets that they think dissemination is really important. So we just ask them what they want to know. Then our team actually develops the questions. I had said in our little breakout room the other day, it always shocks me how many researchers come up with close-ended questions, just yes, no questions, which obviously will not have a lot of value, but they still do that. Would you join this study? Like, I feel like we're not going to get a lot of information out of that, just as an example. So I'm curious, other colleagues, are you all creating your kind of loose facilitators guides based on your feedback with researchers?
So at Meharry, when we have our planning meeting with the researchers, we do ask them to come with questions. And then in the meeting, we work through those questions on what they should be, what they should look like, to make sure that we're answering what they're looking for. And then we also come up on the side like prompter questions. So underneath them, so like, if we open a wide open question, we're not getting anything, we kind of list some prompter questions, just so we have that in our back pocket when we start the studio.
I just want to jump in really quick on the questions. So I have a very strong qualitative background, even though I haven't done studios yet. But I'm going to post a reference in the chat that I highly recommend on good interviewing techniques, which can definitely apply to facilitating studios. And it talks about how to write open-ended questions. But a very common thing that I do with any when people give me close-ended questions, I just change it to like tell me what you think about blah, blah, blah. That's just a really easy way to shift the question to be more open-ended. So rather than, would you join the study? Tell me what you think about the study. Or when you're trying to prompt for more information, tell me more. Those are just really easy go-tos to get more information.
Yeah, I'll say when we're informing messaging, we might use questions like, what about this study did you find interesting? What about this study caught your attention? And those are the kinds of things that then we'll prioritize in the messaging feedback that we give to researchers, the things that really resonated with community folks. And then we also do the opposite. What about this study really turns you off? What are some reasons why you would be hesitant to join the study? And then we'll wrap back around and try to address whether or not those are things that we can even make changes to. Right? We can't make a bad study good. And we all know that sometimes there's just some bad studies out there. I don't know what to say. Ed, I think I see you have your hand up.
Yes, thank you, Tiffany. So what I wanted to say with, first of all, in terms of questions for our studios, those are pre-negotiated between the researchers, the Community Faces of Utah organization, and the facilitator. So we already know what questions we're going into the studio with. And actually the researchers have very little or almost no interaction in the studio itself. It's just between the facilitator and the group. Now, one thing that we find works is that we have two facilitators in most of our studios. One facilitator is a member of the group, of the community group that's been investigated or that's involved in the discussion, and the other facilitator is an academic. And between the two of us, we tend to negotiate the questions. Now, I just wanted to talk a little bit about how we've used the chat in a way that really worked for me when I was facilitating. And Bree was the co-facilitator, but I was doing all the talking, which I tend to do. Bree would just send little recommendations, time recommendations, question recommendations through the chat just between her and I that the other participants didn't see. And it really worked quite well. Sorry, that's all I have to say. Aren't you lucky?
Thank you so much, Ed. Thank you. I was actually scrolling through the chat a bit because I've noticed that all of our colleagues are being great about trying to answer people's questions in the chat. And I wanted to make sure that folks knew that the chat can be like downloaded and saved, and we can clean it up and send it to everyone.
Great. That was my concern too.
Yeah, someone smarter than me is doing that, but yes, that's gonna happen. So you guys will get all the answers to the questions that are being asked. And so I'm just kind of scrolling through, and I saw Heidi had a lot of questions, and I'm not sure if someone's answered them yet because I haven't gone that far through. But yes,
I think those are easy to do to answer via chat. If I have some talk time, I have some like better discussion questions.
Yeah, but I do think you asked a great question about sharing. We are happy to share the notes and recommendations from yesterday's studio with everyone. I don't think that will be a problem, but I'll just let everybody know that now so they'll have a chance to see it. But did you have other questions, Heidi?
Yeah, so I know in the past you and I and your team have talked a lot about who to include, what specific populations to include in studios, and in the past, you were very adamant about only having, like in New Mexico, for example, only having the Latino, Latinx people in a group rather than Latinx and white people. Yesterday, obviously, there were Black and white people. I'm just wondering, I'm just having such a hard time deciding who to include in these groups, how you choose when to mix cultures, races, or not.
Yeah, for sure. So I'll say honestly that for me, there's no like exact science to this. We just kind of like go with what our gut instinct tells us. So for that particular project, we knew that both researchers really wanted to make sure that Black and brown voices were represented in the studio. We could not recruit any Latinx folks for that studio. We tried. and we couldn't. And I will tell you, historically, we have had a really difficult time recruiting folks who have kidney disease, which is crazy to me because it's not that uncommon of a problem, unfortunately. But we even a couple of years ago went to the kidney disease walk on a Saturday, like 5 of us, and we passed out flyers and we talked to people and we talked to families, and the Kidney Foundation pushed it out, and we still had trouble recruiting for that studio. It's the craziest thing to me. So, and I don't know if you noticed yesterday that we talked about support groups, and there are no local support groups here. We have one that's a little bit outside of Nashville, and it only has like 10 people. And so that's just like surprising. So just because we knew we had such a difficult time recruiting, we decided as a team that we felt like that common struggle of dealing with kidney disease was enough, that we felt like folks were going to have enough in common, that it was a shared experience. B, we would over recruit. So I think if you noticed yesterday, we like over recruited Black Americans to be in that studio so they could dominate that space if that's what they needed and wanted to do. So hopefully that would make them feel more comfortable knowing that was like their space. So that's why we went that direction with that particular studio. Is really, it was just A, the recruitment challenges, and B, we felt like from a disease standpoint, we thought there would be enough in common with folks that would pull them together. We also weren't speaking about things that I also think are unique experiences for folks related to the healthcare system. So we weren't asking them to enroll in a study. If I was asking folks to enroll in a study, then I feel like the questions and the experiences might have been really, really different. And I would have opted not to have mixed demographics of a group. But this was just getting feedback on a survey and supports and resources that they felt like would be helpful for folks that were struggling with this particular disease. Does that help? Okay. And folks can chime in if you felt differently about it or you thought it could have been done better. We're here to learn too. I did not sense that during the studio anyone felt uncomfortable sharing. I didn't pick up on that, but we'll also let you know when we get our evaluations back if anybody shares anything that we can learn from. Any other thoughts about the studio yesterday? Questions, feedback that would be helpful for our team?
It looks like there's a question for Ed from Robin.
Ed, how did you navigate having one facilitator being part of the group of experts, like a plant?
You know, he mentioned that when he was speaking just a minute ago, and yeah. I thought, what?
Yeah. So for example, if it were the American Indian group, and I work with American Indians, I would be one facilitator coming from the group itself. And then the other facilitator would be someone from CCTS.
Oh, it was not part of the expert group, not serving as an expert.
No.
But from that culture or from that demographic, yes. Or
right. That was familiar with working with that particular group. And I think Bree might be able to elaborate on this. I think they might have done that for some of our other groups. I know when they work with our African refugee group, I think one of the facilitators also translates, but I'm not sure about that.
Thank you.
And Fahina might talk about that a little later. Oh, go ahead, Bree, sorry.
No, that's okay. Ed, you answered Robin's question perfectly. And that is part of the benefit of having these community connections is that when someone is talking to someone that they feel understands them and has a similar background, it makes the conversation flow a little bit better because there's that trust and that commonality that exists. So we don't use them for every session, but when we do like a studio with just one particular background or community, then we may utilize our community facilitators for that.
I like that idea. Thank you.
Hi, it's Yolanda. I read that question a little differently. I have the opportunity of being both a contract community facilitator as well as a community expert. And when I go into the studios, I wear the particular hat that I'm assigned that day. Some days I'm a patient. Sometimes I'm representing a community-based organization, and sometimes I have to go in and be a facilitator. I like there was a point mentioned earlier about creating a facilitator's toolkit. And what I would encourage anyone to include in your facilitator's toolkit and training is implicit bias training, looking at making sure that the person coming in to facilitate, representing whatever community that they are representing, is aware of their biases and how they show up and how those can be communicated during studios. So sometimes when I'm asked to be a participant, I go in and I'm not Yolanda, I'm not trying to help Tiffany or Leah rewrite the questions. I'm not trying to help the group. My job that day is just to answer and give my expert opinion as a patient or as a caregiver or as a community-based organization. So I think that to the degree an organization can help prepare the persons coming in to understand their role for that day, somewhat mitigates that bleeding and crossover.
I should say that Yolanda is particularly good at that. Not all of our folks are good at that. She's really great at that, of like setting some boundaries and putting those hats on. And, we have learned over the years that community engagement studios are stepping stones for patients and community members to jump into research in different roles if they have that interest. We've had community experts who've been hired to work for research studies. We've had some who have been brought on advisory boards. We had one who was a community expert and then moved into being a national co-PI for a study. So it's really a stepping stone for those folks who get like really interested and want to do more in research. There's a lot of different roles that they can play. And I don't know if you all are seeing this across the country in the spaces you work in, but we are getting more and more and more requests from researchers to identify patients that they can collaborate and partner with, whether it's as I know some people use the term as citizen scientists, we use the term community investigators, but advisory councils, like we get requests pretty frequently through our core from researchers who are looking for patients from a certain demographic or a disease pattern that they'd like to collaborate with. We utilize the community engagement studio model for the Recruitment Innovation Center, which is a part of the NIH. And the community engagement studios is one of the key services that you can receive. And we did one, for instance, for a research team out of the University of Washington, and following it, they reached out and said there were these two experts that were really active in the call today, and we'd love to reach out to them. And so we'll email those experts and say the research team would love to connect with you to see if there's some opportunity for consulting or being a part of their project. Can we share your information? If they say yes, then we just connect them, and we kind of step out at that point. Unless they're internal investigators at Vanderbilt, where we can provide like some support about how do you work with community investigators and why should you compensate them and why should you have a job description, those sorts of things. So that's getting a little out of studio space, but a lot of times when you do this work, you're going to be called upon to do some of those other things because you'll have these connections in place, I feel like. We had a community expert who introduced themselves one time as they introduced their community role first, but then said, and I am also a community or I can't remember the term they used, but research was a part of the way they introduced themselves. And it was this aha moment for our team where we were like, oh, see, if they are starting to identify themselves as a part of the research world, they no longer can be a community expert, like they've transitioned, and that's okay. But we don't utilize that person anymore for studios because we've recognized that their lens is different now. And that's okay. They just have a different lens. Other thoughts, questions, things you all want to share? Anybody see any themes come out of the studio yesterday if you were writing up recommendations?
I see Ed's hand is up, and I had earlier that Robin's hand was up. I don't know if her question got answered.
Let's start with
That
Robin.
was just the Ed question. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So, here's the reason why you probably never want me to be involved in any of your projects, because, I kind of like operate off the hip. I'm a bit of a loose cannon. And even as a facilitator, if I'm in a situation where I'm there to be part of a group just to respond to questions, that's one thing. But when I'm a facilitator, I don't hesitate to switch roles, because sometimes when I tell my story, it helps the people feel a little bit more liberated to go deeper into their stories. Like yesterday, if I was a facilitator for the group on on the kidney issue, I tell them, hey, listen, I'm a kidney patient. I have only one kidney. These are some of the things that I have to do. I want to know how much water I have to drink and all that sort of stuff. And also, if I were on dialysis, I know that water is a factor that you have to limit on. See, I would sort of like overstep my boundaries, and I know that. And then sometimes a lot of our students that come in to support their research professor, I don't let them sit around and just observe. I want to know their stories and how that fits into the discussion. It might be a bad thing, but I do it all the time and they still have me. So I thought I'd just say that.
Well, that's good. It's good that you're collaborating with Utah, Ed.
Yeah, actually, last I heard, they wanted to send me to, I think they wanted for me to apply for a job at Meharry or Vanderbilt. One of those places. I'm not sure. No, thank you.
Your application has been accepted and approved. Ed, we'll be waiting for you.
I can appreciate why you feel the urge to do that. And I'd be curious from all of our qualitative research colleagues that are on here, why they don't do that when they're facilitating focus groups and things of that nature. I think that all of us carrying these like life experiences probably can find something to relate to. And most of the studios that we do, to be quite frank, I am incredibly careful to try not to shape the dialogue, not shape the feedback. I think that's what's really most important. Prior to doing studios, I conducted a lot of focus groups. And I think it's really, really important to make yourself relatable, but also not, again, kind of shaping the feedback and the information that you're getting. And it's a fine line. It's a delicate balance. So I think that that's kind of important. But Heidi, I see you have your hand up.
Thank you. So before I get to my next question, one thing that really stood out to me yesterday that I wrote down and highlighted, I just loved it at the very beginning. I can't remember who said it. She said regarding the doctors that she's seen, that they act like they're the experts. It's a collaboration. You went to school for this, but it's my body. I loved that so much.
I just want you to know that Bree is enthusiastically nodding at your phenomenal note taking.
So I am really curious about your voucher system, because we've talked about doing something similar. We have a little bit of funding to provide studios free of cost to some investigators, but not everybody. So what does the voucher system look like? I know you said you haven't turned anyone away, but if you had too many, how would you choose who to keep and who to turn away?
Yeah, absolutely. And Colleen, if you don't mind jumping in here, I was just going to set some context, but I feel like you know significantly more about the voucher system than I do. And I can just speak kind of high level in terms of, for us historically, as I said earlier, we've never been told we have a limitation. But I will say that if we reached a point where we have a lot of repeaters, once someone does a studio from a particular department, like say cardiology, ICU, I think we mentioned this yesterday, infectious disease, then everyone from their department hears about it and starts coming for community engagement studios, which is why we don't advertise it all. So I think what would probably happen for us is we have had multiple researchers who have done a series of studios to inform their project. So I think telehealth was one of the ones that was mentioned yesterday, and we did 3 studios with distinct patient populations. We did one around flu vaccines, and we did one with folks who constantly will not get their flu vaccine for their child, and those who have but then have changed their mind, just to get the different perspectives on that. We did one for a LGBTQ project that was a social media campaign around oral health, and we divided the groups up based on age, because we knew their use of social media was really different based on age. if we had to start limiting folks, we'd have to start asking researchers to prioritize the demographic that was most important to them to get feedback on. I think that's the number one thing we would have to do. So instead of getting multiple studios, you might just simply get one studio for that project. But Colleen, can you speak to how our voucher system works?
Sure. So we have CTSA funding allotted to provide vouchers around a variety of areas. So it's basically the CTSA has funding to support reimbursement of participants in paying our studio staff to hold studios. And so investigators go through a request system and can ask for a variety of resources, including community engagement studios, but we also provide resources like some limited pilot funding, use of our clinical research center. We have our translational studio program, biostatistics support, those sorts of things. And so people apply based on the funding level. There are different levels of review. And so if you ask for more pilot funding, you get a more intensive review. And we do try to spread the wealth around. We keep careful data on who's using our system. And we have both junior staff as well as full professors that use it. For the studio program, I would say that I can speak to the translational studio program, which, you know, we have academic experts as opposed to community experts on our panel. We have a lot of junior staff that utilize that extensively. So we kind of front load to support our junior staff. So that's one of the things we think about. We've also added additional criteria in the last few years for review around the project's promotion of diversity and health equity and inclusivity. So there's multiple things that we can consider to start titrating down which studios we would support if we reached a point where there was not enough bandwidth to support all the studios. But I would say Tiffany's absolutely right. We limit, or we could think about limiting on who's been a frequent flyer, who we feel like probably doesn't need to use this as their community mechanism and may want to take the next step in engaging the community that is beyond studios, and reserve those resources for folks that may be new into that space of community engagement, or their project definitely has a unique niche that really requires community feedback before proceeding. A good example is COVID-19. We have lots of people that want COVID-19 studios to engage, as you can imagine, the Black and Brown community to get their opinions on various things about vaccine readiness, those sorts of things. And so at some point, it's making sure that when investigators come to this for those types of studios, that we're really thinking about what questions are we asking, and have we really already asked those before, because we've done several COVID-19 based studies.
And if you've asked those questions before, do you send them to talk to the other research team that asked those questions, or do you provide that information?
I'm going to let Tiffany jump in, but my understanding is that we do have a repository of notes that we've collected from studios, and we're able to provide some general guidance and best practices based on the feedback we've gotten in those previous studios. So we don't lock it down so that nobody gets to benefit from that knowledge in the future.
Yeah, I'll give an example, particularly with the Recruitment Innovation Center work that we're doing. And that's something I should mention as a funding possibility for folks across the board. If your institution is applying for large scale grants, the opportunity to have studios to be a part of that system, for instance. So the Recruitment Innovation Center, Precision Medicine Initiative, all of us included studios in their project. So there are other opportunities to include studios in those really large funding proposals, I think, which is important to remember. And that keeps us going. And I don't think Bree is ever going to have to worry about job security at Utah. They're rock stars. So I thought that was cute. She put that in there. You're never going to have to worry about it. But in terms of utilizing notes, so we've done this for 11 years. We have a couple hundred studios under our belt now. We've got all the notes that are in there in our RedCap database, which you're going to learn more about data from our data wizard, Leah Dunkel, later today. And I can't not stress how valuable and important that data is to whether or not you want to publish with it, learn from it. For the Recruitment Innovation Center, they wanted to do a COVID toolkit. And I worked with our rock star, Julia Dunnigan, who is our social media guru and is over all of the websites, et cetera. We worked together, and she worked on the design and the layout and the structure of the toolkit. And I pulled 11 years worth of studio feedback and cataloged it and pulled it into themes, for lack of a better description, on how to create materials and messaging related to particular demographics of groups. And so we color coded it. So if a studio had African Americans all giving their feedback versus Latinx Americans versus over 65 versus essential workers, those were the 4 categories. And we pulled all of the feedback and then nuanced it. So we collapsed it. And if you go through that toolkit, then now researchers will see, oh, if I'm working with a particular demographic, this is the feedback they gave on how to culturally tailor messaging. Oh, if I am this is the feedback they gave on training up my staff who's doing recruitment. Oh, this is the feedback they gave on websites. So I was really excited about that project because it was like a culmination of 11 years of work that we were able to pull from. And I thought that had significant value because it represented hundreds of people from across the country. So there's lots of really creative and innovative ways I think we can use a lot of the feedback we're getting from community experts for even future projects we don't know about.
And this is Alicia. I am a part of the All of Us project, which actually the community engagement studio model was foundational to writing the engagement core component of this grant, which is a huge research landscape, a $1 billion landscape. But the way to really capture the intersectionality of the different populations we want to reach on the All of Us study, and I'm not a part of the recruitment effort. Ours is engagement core, where we embody the value of participants as partners, where the participants actually sit in the governance groups and make decisions, priority set. But in order to really represent the underrepresented biomedical research participants in All of Us, was it 76 community engagement studios you did within a series of months, Tiffany, across the United States, and very thoughtfully?
Yeah, and that was like a huge team effort, I have to say, and with the most wide variety of demographics possible. That's what I thought was so impressive about that initiative with All of Us.
And I do remember you also had some great differently abled groups. I was lucky enough to be a part of those that were visually impaired, and actually a couple members of your team that I was able to join. We went to University of Rochester, to the School of the Deaf, and that was the most illuminating community engagement studio ever that I've ever attended for many reasons. So thank you for that opportunity.
No, I love that. It was a huge team effort. There were like dozens of staff who kind of were onboarded to be able to do studios across the country for that one. One of the ones that I was able to do for that one is a group of unhoused men in Nashville. And I think the most profound thing that came out of it for me was I had everyone from folks who did not complete high school to someone with their PhD. And I had 2 people who had worked for Vanderbilt for over a decade. And so it was just a really like eye-opening opportunity. I told you all, every time I do a studio, I walk away like a better person and certainly learning from others' experiences. And that was one of those that really sat with me for a while. And it was a phenomenal studio. It was very informative. But so I guess the thing that is the take home from all of this that I hope everyone is hearing is that there are a lot of creative opportunities at your institutions to fund community engagement studios. It's just about making sure our leadership are aware that this is a resource, that it's valued, that it's something that's used across the country as a national model, and that they can talk with their colleagues about it. Like we can certainly share a list of colleagues across the country that are champions. I think Robin, Dr. Dan Cooper is a huge champion of community engagement studios. He always speaks really fondly, and he seemed to really enjoy his experience doing them. So I think that there's folks like Dan across the country who could share with their colleagues why they think this is valuable and why they should be including it in their funding proposals. And I'll also say that there are some opportunities for us to collaborate. The folks who are actually implementing the model on the ground, if we could get leadership from buy-in to do a more evaluative study to show, our research showed that the feedback in a community engagement studio is patient-centered, right? Probably not a huge surprise to most of the people in the room, but it showed that our feedback is patient-centered, which can have that impact on proposals and research projects. But what we haven't been able to show definitively via research is that it can in fact improve recruitment. It can in fact improve retention. It can in fact improve the overall experience of research participants. We haven't been able to show that definitively via research. We have that one white paper, right? But that's one little project that we shared yesterday where 100% adherence and 100% retention with those she recruited after her studio. but there are NIH demonstration grants and other grants that we could collaborate on if we had leadership support that would fund studios as well, because the studios would have to be conducted and we would have to have some that didn't have a studio and some that did, and somehow we're able to randomize those in a way where we felt like they were a good comparison of the impact studio feedback had. So I'm just planting little seeds for everyone out there in case there's interest.
Tiffany and team, do you remember the first studio pivot you did when the pandemic hit, 408 days ago? I do remember the STAR CRN, and the acronym eludes me, but this is a PCORI funded project for stakeholders and engagement and technology, clinical research network. You did the HERO study, which was a COVID related project. That was a pivot, and that was a virtual studio in May, I think.
It was not our first studio. That was with Dr. Russell Rothman, and that was not our first one. Leah and Devan, correct me if I'm wrong, but our first one was actually with Dr. Paul Harris. And I remember that because I remember thinking Paul had participated in studios before, so I felt like he was a friendly. And so if we were going to pilot something with him via, these remote studios, I was excited that we had some friendlies in the room to pilot it with who would be forgiving if we had flubs, as you said yesterday. So that was our first studio, but our team actually had done remote studios prior to COVID because we were doing rare disease studios. And one of those was for Dr. Dan Cooper that I referenced just a minute ago that works with Robin. We did one with children caregiver dyads who had cystic fibrosis. And I think we used Leah Google Hangouts for that, if I'm not wrong.
I believe we did, yes.
Yeah, Leah did the gracious, she helped us troubleshoot multiple technologies and platforms that were available at that time. We tested it on our own colleagues at work where they all remoted in on Google Hangouts and pretended to be experts so we could walk through everything. And so that was our very first studio. And Leah, do you remember what year that was? Way before COVID.
I want to say it was 2017 or 2018.
Yeah, it was way before COVID. So we already had like a little bit of experience. We knew we had to have at least 3 team members. We knew that we had to do some orientations to the technology. So we kind of had a basic understanding of what we needed to do to do an online studio. But yeah, our first one was actually with Dr. Paul Harris. And Leah, do you remember our exact topic?
I believe it was about integrating electronic medical records with a platform known as Research Match.
Yes. So getting people's feedback on how comfortable they felt, what concerns they would have, what kind of messaging should happen to inform people, those sorts of things. Other thoughts about yesterday's studio? Do y'all have any feedback for us, for our team, or questions about how we were able to pull it off? Or questions for your colleagues that you have? You've got access to a lot of folks on here that are doing studios across the country, and we all have like little different nuances to our programs for sure.
Tiffany, this is George. I'm going to jump in.
Yes,
I was just going to say, I really, really, really loved the clarity and the precision of your language. I mean, you didn't say more than you needed to say, and you didn't shortchange anyone. It was just very precise and very clear. And I wish I could do that all the time. So it was really very good. Thanks.
Well, thank you, George. You're very kind. I wish I too could do that all of the time. But thank you. That's very kind of you to say. I think I heard somebody else was going to jump in there with George.
It was me. I saw, Heidi, your question about the email we send, or was it, yeah, about the email we send to experts. I just wanted to clarify that's what you were looking for pre-studio.
I just want to know everything you send to the experts before or what they talk about. I get the Zoom orientation, but I just want to know about everything else that you give to them or have them do or review before the studio.
Yeah, I think it depends too, because if you have folks who have been in multiple studios, you could just be like, oh, it's with this person, right? Some of them are just really savvy, whereas some of them you're going to need, they don't know what a CE studio is. They might need help with Zoom. We get some feedback that we're not giving enough information beforehand. A lot of people are good students, right? And they want to review the grant or something beforehand. And it's just that the investigator isn't sharing that sensitive document, right? So trying to give as much information as the research team is comfortable with. So I think I just covered about 3 things. We'll sometimes send like the Zoom tips and tricks if folks are unfamiliar with Zoom, and just some of those group norms. If they have been like any information that the study team can share with us, we'll send out. We had one that they wanted to just review communication, like a newsletter, so a old sample versus a new sample, and having folks compare that. So I hope that makes sense. I gave a lot of information.
It does. And I know Tiffany mentioned sending out the questions beforehand too.
I was going to say, I kind of agree with Megan, and I think Utah does a little different even than the both of us do, but we never send slides ahead of time. That's something we never do, and we've never had that requested before. We do, of course, review and edit slides for the research team to make sure there's no jargon, it's clear, it's concise, it's easy for laymen to understand. I feel like confidently, if I don't understand what medical terms they're using, no one else will. If I'm having to Google things, then it shouldn't be on your slide deck. And so that's one of the pieces. But if we have a high volume of material or something that's more dense that we're going to have to work through, we will send that in advance. If it's a consent document, if it is a survey, if it's a focus group guide, we tend to send those in advance with some prompters for people to think about. So their prompters for yesterday were to walk through the survey and to ask themselves if they thought the question was clear and concise. Did they understand what was being asked of them? Were there any questions that made them or others that they're aware of? As you know, there were several people who had other family members with kidney disease. Were there questions that would make them or others they knew of feel uncomfortable answering? Were there any gaps in knowledge, things that they weren't asking that they felt like were really important and integral to the patient experience? And then if they could set priorities for questions, if they thought certain questions were priorities, and if you were getting rid of anything, please get rid of this one. And I felt like yesterday, based on their feedback, they had all kind of considered those things when we walked through the questions. Now, I will say, if we're giving feedback on materials, when we used to do this in person, I really liked the opportunity to get someone's first impression. You've walked into your doctor's waiting room and you see this flyer. Tell me what your first impressions are. Does it catch your attention? Is there anything that kind of turns you off? Would you pick it up? And if not, how can we work it today together so that you would pick it up? So I like their first impressions about things like flyers. But to Megan's point, if it's a dense amount of information we're going to get through, we'll send that in advance. But we also give some prompters. You know, we do a lot of technology studios now. We've done studios around AI, around a lot of phone apps. Studies are starting to use more text-based and applications for their studies. So we a lot of times will have to set up testing accounts, and we ask the studio experts to go through and test the app. One that was really cool was a resident oncologist who created a pain app via your cell phone, specifically for cancer patients. He had found in his lit review that cancer patients were not reporting increases in pain as frequently as they probably should have, and they felt like that was impacting their ability to heal and have a more positive experience overall in their healthcare. And so he created an app that in the morning and at night, they would just open up the app and they would just pick a smiley face for how they were feeling. And then there was a little free box that they could put a message in if they wanted to. And that immediately went to a dashboard twice a day. And a nurse in the clinic was monitoring the dashboard. And if the nurse started to see a small uptick in pain, then she would report it to the doctor, and then the doctor could communicate to the patient to see what they could do to help alleviate the pain they were experiencing. Because they found that cancer patients time and time again were just suffering, and they didn't want to call, or they were too tired, or there were things going on. And so I thought that was the coolest way. And so we actually had individuals with chronic disease where pain is a major factor join that studio. So some were folks who had been cancer patients, but we also had some other folks who chronic pain was a recurring condition, and they loved it. We had one person who's older who was like, I will invest in this technology if you want to build this out. I will invest in it. It was so cute. So that's just an example of some things we have to send out occasionally.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, Stephen.
Yeah, good morning. Stephen Blakesley from Oregon Health and Science University. Thank you so much for this. This is great. I had a question. You said, I think you mentioned that you spend a fair amount of time, if you're going into a new topic, that you would spend some time researching it to prepare yourself. And it seems like sometimes that might while beneficial to understand the language, it also moves you away from being completely neutral. And you kind of arm yourself, perhaps, as they say, with just enough information to be dangerous, right? So can you talk a little bit about that, and when you're, where that information sits in the back of your head as you're facilitating?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things I want to know before I meet with a research team is how easy or difficult will it be to recruit the particular demographic they've already expressed interest in talking to. So I'd like to know going into the meeting, if they say, we really want to talk with these types of patients, well, do those patients exist? How hard will it be to recruit them? Are they geographically located in certain areas? And an example was a Lyme disease study that came through the Recruitment Innovation Center once. And I was like, interesting, where would we find folks? Like, how could we? And they are actually very concentrated, as well, you live in Oregon, they're very concentrated in certain regions of the country. And so I will do a little reading on who does this disease impact the most? Where are folks located? If there's some regional pieces to that, does it impact a certain demographic of patients more than the others? I'll usually do a quick lit review to see if other studies have had difficulty recruiting certain demographics or populations, because a lot of times if it's an early researcher, I've been surprised to hear that they don't even know the challenges that they may be facing. But if I've read in literature that there's a particular demographic of patients that don't enroll in these studies consistently, we can reference that in the planning meeting and see if that's a group of folks that maybe they should prioritize to reach out to, because they're not being engaged in studies, but they clearly are being impacted by this condition, et cetera. In terms of the other research that I do, I was really speaking more to the norms of a certain group. So for instance, when we were doing the studio with transgender youth, that's a demographic I'd not worked a lot with. I have a wide diversity of friends, but I actually don't have any friends who are transgender. So I started doing some just social media kinds of research and reading some blogs and reading some op-eds and stuff, just to get some pulse on what was happening in that particular community, because I wanted to be educated about it in relation to this particular study, which is genetics. And what I learned really quickly is there are a lot of folks from that community who are very wary of genetic studies related to this particular issue, because they're worried the findings will be used against them. That seemed logical to me, but I'm glad I did some reading so that I kind of had that in my head as we did this studio. That just helped me with some of the nuances associated with it. It also will help me with questions and prompters. If I make note when I read some articles that there are particular symptoms that are more common than others, and that's a focus of our studio, it'll help me develop some prompters. So those are the kinds of things that I'm looking for when I'm trying to prepare myself for a planning meeting with a researcher. Like, I want to know when they mention certain things that I understand what they're saying and what the challenges might be in something. Does that help?
Yeah, so I think that gave me some clarity. It seems like it's more for the preparation as opposed to the facilitation.
Yes, and I am also a big nerd. And so I have like hundreds of research articles cataloged in my bookmarks manager. So anytime we're working on a particular disease or a certain demographic, I have the opportunity to teach a med school class called community healthcare, and they all make fun of me because when someone asks a question in class, I, within like 3 or 4 minutes, can pop 3 current articles in the chat and be like, hey, this is for you. And they'll be like, how do you do that? Where is this information? I'm like, when I can't sleep at night, who else does lit reviews when you can't sleep at night? Anyone? So yeah, I just find that it helps me. I like to.
I'm a though.
Oh, you don't? I think sometimes too, PIs are really surprised when our team goes into a meeting that we can so eloquently speak about the condition that they're researching, and we ask really valid, important questions. I think that instills confidence in the PIs we're working with to do studios. They're like, oh, they know what this condition is. They've clearly done their homework. They're asking the right questions. If I don't do that, I feel like I run the risk of a PI maybe not having confidence in the model, confidence in our team. So I like to walk in there knowing exactly what I'm talking about. Great, wonderful. That's a great question though. And certainly not an expectation. Bree, Heidi, Jillian, you guys probably don't nerd out like that. And there is really no need for you all to do that. That's just one of my nuances, I think, that's developed over the years. And Stephen, I think it's because I don't come from a research background. I came into this position after being on our advisory council for our community engagement research corps. I worked for an organization. I was the director of programs for community organizing, and I left that position. I actually worked with Yolanda, and I left that position to join Vanderbilt specifically to launch this model and to create it. And so I think I felt like they said that imposter syndrome. I felt like I had to, sort of like up my game a little in the research world to feel confident maybe. Other questions or thoughts, feedback about the studio? I was curious if anybody like had some recommendations that they would throw out from the studio after you were able to like take your notes and sit with it. Did anyone have any recommendations that they would share?
My only recommendations would be for the not for you, well, maybe a little bit for you, but when the PIs or co-PIs, when they were doing their overview, there were some words that they use like prognosis, and I mean maybe everyone in the group already knew those, but I try to just steer away from anything that's not just very simple language. And if someone uses specialized language words, I as the facilitator will try to explain that just to make sure everyone knows, like, oh, I heard this acronym. If I don't know the acronym, I'll ask them to explain it. Or I heard prognosis, just want to let you know this is what they're talking about. So it just seemed a little higher level than plain language in the presentation, but maybe this group was already very familiar with everything because of their medical history.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. And I honestly don't even remember the use of prognosis. I was probably like so nervous that you guys were all listening in. I will say, I do feel like, and Devan and Leah can speak to this, this was a particularly high health literacy group. And many of them had lived with this condition for a while. And so that's probably why I didn't invest a whole lot of thought into that. But to your point, I think it's really important when any terminology or acronyms are used in studios to pause for a moment and say to the PI, and I usually will say things like, Stephanie, would you mind, could you explain what that is for a moment? I don't know what that is, or I'm sure everyone in the room probably doesn't. I try to like make it so it doesn't look like I think that, the patients in the room don't understand, because there's this fine line between like talking down to people, right? And we have selectively chosen to leave certain terms into slide presentations that we knew were tricky terms, because we thought that the folks in the community engagement studio would benefit from learning what that term was, that was going to be a part of their care, that was going to be a part of these studies. They may hear it later. And we have gotten feedback from experts that, oh, thank you so much. I feel like I know so much more now. I learned so much. So it's this balance of, not overloading people with these terms and acronyms, but also giving them an opportunity and a space to learn what some of these things are so that they can come out as an advocate for themselves and their community. It's, again, just this fine balance, but I agree with you, always explaining those sorts of things. Did you have a recommendation from yesterday, Heidi, that you would recommend to the research team?
Oh, just the only recommendation I had was just that, just like if you catch words like that are being used either by the experts or the clinicians or anybody, just clarifying it. That's really my only recommendation. I thought it was fantastic in every way.
Okay.
Can I touch on that real quick for Heidi? One thing as a facilitator I use, even if I know what those acronyms are, and even if I know what these words are, I always try to play like, this is going to sound bad, but the dumbest person in the room. Right? So I want to feel like, instead of an expert who may not feel like, oh, I don't want to be the only person that says, I don't know what this means. I'm like, I don't know what that means. Like, I will always ask like for clarifying questions so that it really puts the power with the participant. So that's just the technique when some of these words are used. I may just be like, do you mean kidney doctor? If they say nephrologist, or what do you mean by that? So that's just a facilitator.
I noticed Jacqueline put in the box that someone said they called each other doctor, which is a no-no. It is a no-no, and I did notice that. And I don't know if you caught on that I immediately started addressing them by their first names to just level that a little bit. And they're both lovely people. I don't think that they had any intention. I think that they are known for having phenomenal bedside manners. I think it's just that culture that's so intrinsic into the work that they do. But I did notice that. And then you said some concrete action items around food, shopping, and cooking. I agree. I think one of the key recommendations for them is to use existing technologies to provide educational information around the things that you just mentioned. Because I feel like, particularly with COVID, that's going to be an avenue that they need to pursue, and we'll give them a couple of examples of how that they can do that. But that'll be one of the key recommendations for sure. People seemed really receptive to that. So I like.
Yeah, I started, sorry that I was typing into the chat at first. My landscapers were right outside my window. But I started thinking about, you know, there are so many shopping apps and food delivery services. It seems like this is like a niche, I don't know how to say it, population that maybe hospitals could partner with local restaurants, things like that, and kind of get something like this done. I think it would be a huge partnership.
This seems like a phenomenal, if I was an MPH student, or even our med students have in their first year have to do a project, this seems like a phenomenal project for a student that they really could put their name on. I think that would be so great. I also think one of the recommendations is going to be around training of physicians within their own space, the creation of a training around the values and priorities of patients and how they can better communicate that. I think that's really important. I heard from multiple people that they weren't getting that. And then for the people who were getting it, how valuable it was. So hopefully they'll consider doing their own internal training. So we'll certainly recommend that.
I'm going to jump in because we are at time for this session. And I think we have a break until 11:45. But before everyone runs off, we have our professional Zoom photographer, Matt, who's going to do our headshots. So Alicia, if you could stop sharing the screen. Everyone get your best Zoom face on. If you can handle it, put your camera on. I guess I should put my camera on. And then Matt, you go ahead and take a couple of shots and let us know when you're done so then folks can run out for their break.
Come on, where's Ed? Ed's back.
Got my headset hair going.
Oh, I'm sure.
Lovely, Colleen, looking lovely.
Great backdrops too.
Where are you, Alicia?
Well, with this, I'm camera ready, but you know, with this setup, I can't show I don't have a camera, but I am camera ready.
Darn it.
Oh, we gotta get you in here, Alicia.
Alicia, come on over here. Put your mask on.
Hi, Dr. Kim.
Please.
Are we doing a countdown?
So we're
Matt's in
missing
charge.
Okay, so I'm just smiling like this, and I don't know if I should stop.
Yeah, we'll have to scroll through because we got a few pages. That's right, Bree.
Ed walked away.
Oh, there's Alicia.
Where did Ed go?
Ed just walked away.
Want me to text Ed?
Yeah, come on, Ed.
I also need feedback from Matt when we're done here.
Right. He's not going to let us know when we're done.
Wait, Ratty. I gave him your 73880. Oh,
social.
576.
Ed, don't tell us your social.
Oh, sorry.
Goodness.
We were all about to go shopping on Ed. All right, Colleen, who's counting down?
So I've got Alicia check in. Matt's been
my
scrolling through the pages looking for everybody taking pictures. So hopefully got a couple of everybody. So she's going to come back and tell us when Matt got what Matt did. What were we paying Matt for?
I'm with Leah or Devan. This
5 more minutes. That's what we've been told.
No,
I still see Devan working really hard.
that's a long time.
He's doing individual grabs. I hope he got Alicia and I because we're not hugging again.
I can come in. We can do A little
There's
hug,
no, we're
group
not doing a
huddle.
three-way hug. That's entirely too much.
Should we do masks to capture the time? If everyone has a mask they want to put on,
Zoom
we'll know it was in
Yeah.
2020 or
I
2021.
feel like Zoom captures.
Yeah, Zoom is the time.
I'm going to put mine on because I think we're all going to still be Zooming after this, so we won't know.
Hey, can I ask Steve? You started to put your hand up when Colleen called for a break. Stephen, did you have a question while we're waiting anyway?
Oh yeah, I was just typing it into the chat. Excuse me. So you keep searching for comments for the facilitator, so I'm going to go for it.
Yeah, please.
I think one of the experts at one point said, and I don't remember the exact detail, but the comment was how it impacted them day to day. And as a facilitator, I would have jumped on that, because when you talk about day to day, that triggers people's individual stories, and it puts them in a certain place and a certain mindset, which would then trigger other thoughts and reactions. And so I had written that down as a point in time to really try to dive in a little bit more.
Yeah. When I go back and listen to the recording now, you know I'll obsess about that.
Just don't let it keep you up at night.
Thank you for that feedback. And I agree, like 100%. That is a great opportunity. Yeah.
And then I had a question too. I was surprised at one point you started making suggestions of actions to take. And as a facilitator, I was, for you being the facilitator, I was surprised that you were doing that.
Yeah, so a couple of scenarios yesterday. One was our incredibly short time span. I wanted to get feedback on the feasibility of a couple of things that we had heard in other studios to see if it vibed with that group or not. So when I asked them, like, would YouTube videos be something that you would even use? Is that something that, or would you appreciate getting XYZ from your doctor, or would that not have value? So that was one of the things I was trying to prompt them to see, was it even going to be feasible or realistic? Because I didn't want to include things in our recommendations about how to disseminate information and reach patients if it wasn't really something patient groups weren't going to be interested in. So that was one of the pieces of things that I was doing. And I feel like there was another point where they had asked a question and I tried to pull in stuff from some other studios that we had heard to get their feedback. And I apologize, I'm blanking. Do you have in your notes one of the other places where I gave recommendations?
I was looking, I didn't find it, and I realized that it's in the chat somewhere.
Okay, well, I'll look back through the chat.
But I don't know if I can't be certain that it references the exact subject at that point in time.
Yeah, there was definitely one other area where I gave feedback from something we had heard in another studio, and I cannot remember what it was. I definitely think that the shortened time span made me feel more rushed. I was so mindful that we were supposed to jump back in the Zoom with you guys that I felt like by the last 10 minutes, I was like, okay, we got to go. I definitely felt
about meals and meals and how to prep and how to shop.
Yes. I was trying to play a little bit off of a lot of the feedback that we got from Marcus and then Richard saying he doesn't want to eat chicken anymore. And we have literally heard that in other studios from people. I don't want to eat another piece of chicken. So that really was funny. That resonated with me because it was so emphatic in a couple of other studios. How are we doing, Colleen?
Let's just go with it. I think everyone needs a bit of a break real quick before we start the next session.
Perfect.
So everyone want to take a 5-minute bio break and then we'll jump back in. I think, is Leah next with a scintillating discussion on data tracking?
The exciting world of data that all of our lives are built around.
I'm a basic scientist. Do not knock the data.
It's going to be so fun, guys. So fun.
It's our favorite thing.
It's our
All right, so everyone in 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you.